The sea was blacker than oil, not night, not even darkness, but a swallowing void that erased ships, swallowed stars, and muffled sound like a coffin's seal. November 14, 1942, somewhere off Savo Island. The Japanese battleship, Kirishima, sliced through the Pacific with practiced aggression. Her silhouette was sleek, tall, built for intimidation, a hunter cruising blind. Believing the night cloaked her like armor, her sailors moved like clockwork. Crewmen raised binoculars, scanned for enemy silhouettes. Lookouts posted on deck strained against the dark horizon, but they saw nothing, they heard nothing, and then the sky exploded. No flash built up to it. No warning shriek, no silhouette rising from waves, just fire. The water erupted as if the ocean itself detonated upward. A 16-inch shell, nearly a ton of steel, dropped from the invisible black dome above and punched through Kirishima's midsection. Within 2 seconds, another followed. Then another. Shells screamed across the water faster than thunder could catch up. From the void to the northwest, a secret ship was speaking, not in words, but in mass and velocity. It was the USS Washington, and unlike Kirishima, she did not see. She knew her radar had walked a target line onto the Japanese dreadnought's path minutes earlier. Her fire control team had spoken their coordinates in surgical calm. Her gunners didn't pray. They verified. Within 7 minutes, Washington fired over 75 shells, 9 of them thundercracking home with brutal precision. Kirishima began to list. Her upper decks erupted in screaming men and shrapnel, steel twisted, ammunition cooked off below dot, and then the silence returned. Except, now it held firelight, the stars reflected in oil and blood. USS Washington turned slightly, as if stepping away from a murder on a dark street. No cheers, no radio chatter, no celebration, only the sound of a dying Leviathan cracking apart in the water, her legacy vanishing into smoke and steam. The USS Washington didn't shimmer. She didn't boast polished brass or polished speeches, but she didn't need to. She was born for function, for war, for victory in the kind of battle no one yet understood. In the autumn of 1942, as America reeled from the sting of Pearl Harbor and struggled to clutch a toehold in the Pacific, Washington was quietly becoming something else, the Navy's hidden vanguard, a new kind of killer, built with minds sharper than steel. She was massive, minus 35,000 tons of armor, 18 million pounds of potential energy. But her real weapon wasn't her guns, it was her eyes in the dark. Radar, an invisible sword in a battlefield, where night used to mean safety. While most ships still relied on lookouts and flares, Washington possessed something different, a new technology, humming with potential. It didn't blink, it didn't breathe, and it never lied. But the men on board, they were flesh, like anyone else. 20-somethings from Kansas, North Carolina, Queens. Most had never seen the ocean before the Navy trained them to kill on it. They called her the Wash. She was home, bonded by salt and sweat, powered by boilers and belief, and at her helm stood Captain Willis Ali, a quiet Kentuckian, with a piercing stare and a mathematician's brain. He didn't speak unless necessary. His uniform was never wrinkle-free. But there wasn't a number about war he couldn't calculate. Trajectory, timing. He had fired guns since boyhood. He trusted Washington's radar more than human eyes. Some mocked him, called him obsessed, a man chasing ghosts on a screen. But Lee knew war was changing, and he would rather trust electricity over chance. In briefings, he told his officers, the night no longer belongs to them. It belongs to whoever sees first. Still, not everyone believed. Many old hands on board scoffed at radar. They called it theoretical, twitchy, a toy for scientists, not sailors. Some preferred certainty. Others still swore by gut instinct, but Lee waited. He knew their moment would come not in sunshine, but in shadow. November 12, 1942, Washington steamed through the slot toward Guadalcanal, her hull cutting water like a sword sheath. The men below played cards, smoked, wondered, not openly, but quietly whether they'd come back. One sailor wrote in his journal, "We're steamrolling toward something. I don't know if it's death or history." They didn't know they were about to become the first American battleship crew in history to sink another enemy dreadnought alone. At night, in under 15 minutes, they didn't know their enemy. Wouldn't even see them, and they didn't dream that. Their actions would become a blueprint for naval combat for generations. They only knew their job, and that the captain trusted a blinking dot on a glowing screen more than 1,000 men with binoculars. The sea around them was calm, but something ancient had shifted. It was about to begin, and Washington would not flinch. November 13th, 1942, nightfall. Aboard the Imperial Japanese Navy's battleship Kirishima, the crew moved like ritual, formal, focused, unstoppable. At every station, tradition held fast. Orders were crisp, uniforms immaculate. Their flagship bore the pride of a 1,000-year empire, and her soul, though made of steel, breathed bushidō, rebuilt from her Great War skeleton into a deadly predator, was once considered obsolete until her engineers reshaped her into something fast, lean, and armored for midnight destruction. She was meant to fly in formation with ancient warriors, her hull painted with discipline and bronze valor. Now, she steamed south, escorting cruisers and destroyers toward Iron Batom Sound. The mission: bombard Henderson Field, silence American airstrips, and pummel enemy support ships near Guadalcanal. It should have been a slaughter, another strike in a growing list of victories, quick, brutal, efficient. One admiral compared it to sweeping away rats with one stroke of the blade. But there was a storm in the sliver of stillness, not from clouds, from confidence. Vice Admiral Nobate Kondo stood firm in the command tower, his white gloves clasped behind his back. His glasses reflected the moonlight and maps. He was highly educated, experienced, a student of Western warfare and Eastern wisdom, but he did not believe in radar. To him, radar was theoretical noise, a child's trick, unworthy of samurai tradition. A man wins battle, not a machine, he once said flatly. You cannot electrify the spirit. Below deck, gunners polished shells, signalmen readied flares. Lookouts kept their faces trained on the horizon, scanning the black with perfect posture, like monks guarding a gate. They believed in steel dot, in the thunder of 14-inch guns, in the glory of visible combat, ship to ship, face to face, their most trusted weapon. Experience: they had crushed the British in the Indian Ocean, dismantled Chinese fleets, driven Americans into retreat more than once. Night fighting was their advantage. They trained in it, lived in it, hunted in it. And tonight, they believed, night would once again belong to them. There were rumors, weak ones, of radar-directed targeting aboard American ships. But in Kondo's war room, it drew only chuckles. Our eyes, he said, are better than any screen. As they passed into the waters of Savo Island, defeat was not even a thought. Their plan was methodical. Kirishima would engage and eliminate American surface ships. Destroyers would sweep forward. Cruisers would strike secondary targets. All would be done before sunrise. The Americans, they believed, would be blind, but they were wrong. Desperately wrong, miles away. And fully invisible, a quiet blinked on a glowing screen. It marked Kirishima's position within inches. No flares. Just numbers, just math, and death was moving closer. Back aboard Kirishima, the crew whispered about their advantage. The Americans had withdrawn many of their ships after the brutal first naval battle of Guadalcanal 2 nights earlier. The South Dakota and Washington were believed to be far to the east, so when South Dakota appeared, steaming, visible, and hot in the dark, the Japanese fleet swarmed. Dozens of guns turned. Illumination, shells soared. Light flooded the Pacific dot, and the beast emerged. Kirishima's turrets, locked in fire, erupted. South Dakota groaned under the blows of distraction. A sacrifice, but what no one saw, what no one could have seen, was what followed in the darkness. A second silhouette, silent, cold, unlit, positioned, waiting, that the Washington had slipped into. Range: she had not fired yet, but her guns were trained. Kondo, watching South Dakota writhe under his fleet's guns, declared, "The American battleship dies tonight." He was only half right. One would burn in the open, the other would ghost in from shadow, and bury a warrior empire beneath 7 minutes of flame. The sea narrowed, the path tightened, and a darkness deeper than ink swallowed both fleets as they entered what Pacific sailors called simply the slot, Iron Batom Sound, so named for the wrecks littered beneath. It, Cruisers, destroyers, battleships, Japanese, American, Australian. Names lost. Hulls cracked open, all rusting together in silence. Now, USS Washington moved silently through that graveyard in the water. Her great engines cradled in thrum, her bridge lit faintly in red dot. No voices were raised. No alarms sounded, but every man felt it. History was coiling just beneath their boots. South of them steamed. South Dakota, the Navy's other big gun, more modern, more armored, she cut a bold shape through the water, clearly visible even in the dark, proud, gleaming, too gleaming. Inside her electrical rooms, a minor fault had begun to creep, then cascade. Power flickered, radar hiccuped, all across her hull. Systems blinked off and on like a body choking on its own heartbeat. Gunnery lost sync. Communication faltered. Screens went blind. The Japanese saw South Dakota first and believed she was alone. A gift, an easy kill. And they swarmed. Admiral Kondo's formation, believing itself ascendant, loosed everything. Flare shells cracked open the night. Sky-blinding bursts of magnesium lightning painted South Dakota in silver and shadow. Kirishima's decks thundered. Cruisers followed. Shells splashed and screamed. South Dakota twisted bleeding flames, taking shell after shell but refusing to die. She was on fire, but in her agony, she was doing exactly what fate and Admiral Willis Lee required of her. She was bait, 7 miles behind and westward. In total darkness, Washington watched radar scouted every angle, every speed, every echo, and relayed a calm, singular truth: the enemy had exposed itself. From her bridge, Admiral Lee stared through the glass toward the chaos, his ship still dark, still invisible. His voice didn't rise when he gave the order. Plot, firing solution. Secondary batteries hold main. Prepare for full salvo. His exec, eyes pale in the red light, asked one question. Fired by radar, sir? Lee didn't answer at first. He nodded. Yes. Let's show them what silence can do. Below deck. Sailors loaded the 16-inch rifles with brutal efficiency. Each shell as tall as a man, weighing as much as a car. Rammed into barrel after barrel, the turrets turned quiet arcs of tonnage, slicing only vibration through the air. The fire control team called out coordinate updates by the second. Target locked. Range, Iwan Batan Wubai yards. Bearing steady. Enemy unaware. One gunner crossed himself. Another simply stared ahead. On the radar, Kirishima hadn't even shifted direction. She was too focused on South Dakota, like a wolf lunging at a decoy. Unaware of the trap in the trees, the light show danced. Relentlessly in the distance, fire. Lapped at South Dakota's decks, enough to make the Japanese believe they were winning. They never saw the predator behind them. Admiral Lee waited. 12 seconds more, then 3 words. Commence main battery. USS Washington shuddered. The ocean tore open. The forward turret unleashed a measured earthquake. Steel, fire, velocity. 8 seconds later, her rear batteries followed. No flare lit the sky. Just rolling thunder in repeated bursts. Radar said 9 hits next to midship within minutes. No eyes needed to confirm Kirishima confused the blasts with secondary ships. Then her decks exploded. From the Japanese side, the trap had no shape, no flash, no muzzle fire, no outline, just devastation in the dark. Shells rained down like guided comets, every strike a surgical signature of radar precision. Ammunition magazines ruptured. Crew screamed as bulkheads burst like tinfoil. A gunnery officer yelled, "How are they hitting us?" No one could answer because no one saw the attack. Aboard Washington, no cheer went up, only data chatter, quiet breathing, the rhythm of new coordinates. The trap had worked, the bait had bled, the prey had lunged, and now the hunter, born in silence, was aiming to finish the kill. But the ocean still held its breath. November 14th, 1942, 0:06 hours. In every war, there comes a moment when history flinches. Not from blood, but from silence. Aboard the USS Washington, the silence was terrifyingly complete. No screaming officers, no shouted commands. Just red-lit corridors and the slow rhythmic voice of radio control, range 18,200 yards. Solution plotted. Confirm 5-point spread. Elevation matched. Firing point in 3... At the center of the bridge, Admiral Willis Lee stood perfectly upright. His face didn't change. His eyes didn't blink. He trusted the math. 3, 2, 1. Washington opened fire. A double broadside 16-inch shells, 9 per turret, roared from her barrels like throttled thunder. Each shell weighed over a ton. They moved faster than sound, screamed across the water at almost 2,500 feet per second. From Kirishima, still focused on the burning South Dakota, it sounded like the sea itself had cracked in half. The first 2 salvos missed, slightly, by 100-yard margins. Near misses big enough to throw up towers of water that rained back down onto Kirishima's deck like steel hail, but by the 3rd salvo, radar adjusted guns corrected. The impossible shot was not impossible anymore. The 4th salvo landed like judgment. The first shell struck starboard midship, cracking through armor, breaching power lines, igniting fire in the machinery spaces. The second hit, near turret number 3, detonating ammunition stores and turning a circular steel deck into vaporized ash. A fireball rose from the deck, higher than the masts, choking the bridge in smoke. 7 minutes into the engagement, Washington had struck Kirishima 9 times with major caliber shells and at least 17 times with secondaries. It was precision unheard of in naval gunnery history. A crewman on Washington's radar team whispered, almost afraid of his own success, "She can't even see us." Kirishima twisted portside, gushing smoke, surrounded by destroyers who now screamed in all directions through fractured radio. She tried to return fire, but it was blind, slow, and staggered. Her rangefinders useless against the unseen beast in the dark. Her shells fell miles short. Some hit the ocean. One splashed near her own escorts. It didn't matter. Washington had already made the night hers. From the bridge, Lee watched Kirishima burn. He didn't smile, didn't look away. He only gave the order, "Keep firing until she's out of range or underwater." Below, loaders moved like cruel clockwork. The guns thundered again. Again, shell after shell dropped with surgical rhythm. Surface. War, once chaos and instinct, had become cold. Calculation, numbers, angles, echoes. This wasn't an artillery exchange. This was a firing squad on Kirishima's bridge. Panic turned to horror. The forward turrets had gone dead. Smoke choked the communication lines. Fire erupted uncontrollably. Power flickered. Helm control was lost. The ship began to drift. Crews attempted bucket brigades. Some jumped overboard. Destroyers circled in frenzied mayday. But Washington kept firing invisible, untouched, unshaken. And then finally, silence. A final shell crashed through Kirishima's power core, and darkness swallowed. Her no more firing, just the hiss of death as the Pacific closed around Japan's pride. On the Washington, the fire team stood down, no fists raised, no cheers. A radio operator removed his headset slowly. Voice hollow, "It's done." In 7 minutes, Captain Lee's ship had done something never seen in naval warfare. It had killed a dreadnought in complete darkness, using math, radio waves, and American steel. The crew sat in stunned quiet. One sailor crossed himself. Another said, "God help whoever fights us next." But even God, it seemed, had been silent that night. She didn't die quickly. Kirishima was proud, once celebrated. Once, mythic was not a ship that would vanish without screaming. As the first rounds tore through her starboard, she staggered but did not bow. Her crew ran through flamelit corridors. They shouted orders between explosions, metal tearing like paper, and the deep moan of a hull groaning under fatal pressure. Below deck, compartments flooded within minutes. Salt water hissed against glowing cable lines. Steam blasted out of ruptured pipes. The engine room faded into black smoke, filled with yelling till there was no yelling, just boiling. On the bridge, Captain Iwabuchi gripped his rail so hard his knuckles bled. His orders still came steady through soot and chaos. Flood lower compartments. Counterflowed portside. Bring us level. But she wasn't listening anymore. Kirishima was turning limping, burning, listing hard starboard. Flames consuming everything above the second deck, and water eating everything below it. Gun crews fought on, even as secondary batteries melted under electrical fires. Even as ammunition lockers detonated behind them, the main gunners screamed "Banzai" and kept loading. They had no acquisitions, no target, but they fired. Toward the dark, just rage in the shape of steel. One crewman barefoot, half his face burned, slammed his hand against a jammed breech and yelled, "If we are to die, let them feel it." He fired once more into the fog and hit nothing. OpenSea.aft, a powder chamber detonated. A flare of orange light burst through the hull like a sunrise from beneath. Men flew through the air like broken puppets wrapped in flame. The flames danced upwards, then sucked out like breath as the sea reached up for her. The wheelhouse was gone. Steering failed. The rudder jammed buttoned. Buttoned sailors in engine blacks climbed ladders with hands, blistering against glowing rails, not for escape, but for duty too. Keep her alive 30 seconds longer. Crushed beneath collapsing decks, they drowned in rising fuel. Still, at their stations. Captain Iwabuchi staggered through smoke that painted the bridge like ash on a war painting. He gave no final speech. No surrender, only this: abandon ship. Those who can still make the fight, stay. It wasn't a command, it was a ritual. One last ride aboard iron fading into history. Some leaped into blackness, into water slicked with oil, lit by the ship's dying glow. Others stayed. Young gunners dragging chains into position, a wounded steward hanging off a rail, passing a canteen to another man with no legs. No one begged. No one cried. They had been taught that death was not failure, but surrender was, and Kirishima had surrendered nothing. From the Washington, they watched her silhouette fold in on itself, twin towers of flame twisting from her decks, then sucked downward into a cyclone of ruin. It was unclear where the final shell struck. Some said near the boilers. Others, the ammunition hoists. All anyone knew is that Kirishima disappeared beneath. The waves before the 7th minute had passed. She took over 300 men with her. On the surface, the water boiled, steam hissed like snakes escaping the underworld. Survivors screamed for moments, then went quiet as oil filled their lungs. And then, silence. No second wave, no call for help, just floating debris. Spinning gently in the current, Admiral Lee on the Washington lowered his binoculars. There was no comment, no report. He simply stepped away from the bridge window below him. Men were praying over their gun barrels. One sailor put down his headset and whispered to the empty air in front of him. They never even saw us. At 0:19 local time, the guns aboard Washington fell silent, not because there were no targets left, but because there was nothing left to shoot. Japanese dreadnought, built from iron and fed by glory, had been erased in the dark by digits, echoes, and angles on a glowing screen. This was not battle. This was execution, and the Americans knew it. No cheers, no songs, only breath coming steady and haunted. That night, as Washington turned silently from the wreckage, a voice came over her internal coms, a bosun, broken by what he saw but unable to say nothing. God forgive us. We fought men, not monsters. And silence answered, because even in victory, there are ghosts that follow you home. The sun rose slowly over Iron Bottom Sound. Not like a victory, like a revelation, smoke hovered above the water in long gray fingers, curling off twisted wreckage and oil-slicked swells. The air smelled of salt, sulfur, and something that lingered deeper. Burned flesh, wet steel, and regret. There was no music. No flag waved freely in the wind. Only the slow roll of spent brass across the decks of ships that had survived what others could not. Aboard Washington, sailors stood at the rails in silence. They looked out over the grave. They had made. No one kept count of the dead. No one had to. The sea told its own story. Floating life jackets, shattered timbers, stained. R.E.D. a lone lifeboat. Drifting empty, they passed a Japanese sailor clinging to debris, vacant-eyed and ash-covered. His mouth didn't move. He didn't call for help. He just stared at nothing, as if his soul had already sunk deeper than the wrecks below. On the far horizon, South Dakota limped northward, smoking, battered, but afloat. She had taken the punishment. Let the enemy believe she was all there was. She had drawn the fire so Washington could kill one of her crew. interviewed months later, said, "We were ghosts. Dragging steel shadows with us, and the other ghost, the Washington, was death itself that morning. Crewmen tried to clean the guns aboard Washington, but the soot stuck. The oil wouldn't wipe off, and in the silence, every ragged breath sounded like blasphemy. One sailor found a piece of fabric lodged in the secondary turret, Japanese. Scorched, he folded it without a word and placed it in a toolbox. Not to keep to remember. The medics treated burns, broken ribs, and concussions, all American. But the real wounds didn't bleed. There were men who collapsed in quiet corners. Unable to sleep, others wrote letters they'd never send, apologies to the ocean, to the men they'd never seen. For pulling a trigger from behind a radar scope, one radar operator couldn't. Stop shaking. He'd seen the math. He'd made the calculations. He knew every range. But only now did he realize. I never saw their eyes. When the sun broke fully through the smoke, ships began recovery. Bodies were pulled from the water. Some American but mostly not. One destroyer crew saw 2 Japanese sailors still chained together, lifeline protocol. Captain ordered them brought aboard. They died within the hour, never speaking a word, heads held high, even as their lungs gave out. The chaplain aboard Washington gave them a burial at sea. He said, "We returned warriors into the hands of a sea that keeps no sides, back in the U.S." Reports came in as cold statistics. USS Washington sinks Japanese battleship Kirishima at night. Minimal damage. Maximum efficiency. But no one spoke of the smoke, the silence, the loneliness of victory aboard Washington. One sailor stood alone near turret 3, smoking a bent cigarette. He whispered to a mate, "That wasn't war, that was math in mourning. Coats." And the Pacific answered him in waves. Some soft, some red victory had come. It did not cheer. It drifted among ash, among ghosts, among men who would never again mistake silence for peace. The message from Washington reached Admiral Halsey's desk just after sunrise. Kirishima sunk. Washington undamaged, mission complete. There were no adjectives, no poetry, just numbers, coordinates, kills. And that was the point. It was efficient. Cold, perfect. The Washington had done what no American battleship had done in modern history. Sunk a full-sized enemy dreadnought alone. At night, using nothing but radar and mathematics, the brass celebrated it. Naval Command called it revolutionary. News tickers in Times Square called it redemption. Scientists called it a proof of concept. But for the men who'd stood in red-lit rooms watching dots instead of silhouettes, it felt different. They hadn't fought a battle. They had performed one. The age of visual warfare gone in one night. The age of instinct. Of lookout towers and voice tubes and binoculars reduced to circuits and echoes where once sailors had seen the whites of the enemy's eyes. They now fired across invisible seas using machines that never blinked, and it worked too well. Across the Pacific, Japanese strategists were stunned. Kirishima was supposed to be untouchable at night, faster than American guns, deadlier, without warning. But radar saw through darkness, saw clean, and destroyed completely. One surviving IJN officer, rescued days later, reportedly asked his captors, "Where was the second ship? We never saw her." When he was told there was no second ship, that the destruction came from one American battleship, hiding in the dark. He didn't respond, just looked at the floor, as if the weight of that sentence had cracked something sacred from that moment on. Japan's surface fleet began to decline, not just in strength, but in identity. Their advantage in night warfare was shattered, their belief in naval honor in one-on-one. Ship-to-ship valor was buried beneath the waves with Kirishima. An admiral later wrote in his diary, "We worshipped the sun, but we were ambushed by shadows." Months later, the Washington returned to port. She was hailed as a marvel of engineering and doctrine. She had every reason to be, but her sailors didn't cheer like victors. They stepped off slowly, eyes tired, backs straight, as if leaving the ship wasn't rest, it was responsibility. From here on, the war would not be won by muscle or eyesight. It would be won by electrons and decisions measured to 4 decimal places. The next naval generation would train in classrooms, not just gun decks, and the maps would change because they had built something even Japan's warrior code could not predict, a silent weapon, powered by math, a battleship. that didn't need to see you to kill you. Radar had proven itself. But buried deep within that cloaked triumph was a quiet mourning. Not for the enemy, but for what had been lost somewhere between the pulse and the trigger. War had moved on. The question now wasn't could you hit the target. The question was, could you still remember the face behind the signal? She never raised her voice. The USS Washington didn't light the sky with searchlights or brake. Formation with bravado, she came in darkness. She whispered through waves, and when she spoke, steel answered for her. The Washington did not win because she was louder. She won because she was invisible. In a war of screaming engines, sirens, and explosions, she made her kill with precision, not fury. The trigger was pulled by radar. The damage was measured in seconds, and the enemy never even saw it. Coming, that wasn't just victory. That was the birth of a different kind of power. One that didn't. Screamed out one that didn't need to. How war would be fought for generations. And yet, the men on her decks didn't cheer. They didn't sing. They looked out onto the wreckage, drifting in the moonlight, and wondered what silence would cost them the next time. Because behind every clean combat report was a kid in a gun turret, shaking. Was a soul wondering who they just erased. The Washington went on to serve with honor, but she is more than a battleship in the ledger of war. She is a ghost on the water. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying weapon is the one you never hear. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe stories like this, told in steel and silence, still deserve to be remembered. For every radar echo, for every ship that vanished into the dark, for every man who waited for a face before pulling the trigger, this was his story.